Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to there is a holding here. Okay, welcome to the international session at Korea Regional Development Association, joint seminar on housing. My name is Sung Yeon Choi. I am the I'm former chief of research and forecast at Southern California Association of Governments in the United States. I've been there for over 25 years. And I'm now currently visiting professor of urban planning and the real estate at Chunghwa University in South Korea. This is the session about single households and housing markets and housing policies. And you know the speakers will tell us as a story of what is happening to the singles and a single household and how these issues are addressed housing market and housing policies, particularly in Amsterdam, Singapore, and the United Kingdom. As chair of international session, I especially appreciate the speakers and discussants from abroad participating in this session. And I know that Richard get up early in the morning to participate in this session, and really I appreciate it. I have an announcement of our session format. Looks like it should be very important. We have two major parts of the current session, along with the short coffee break between two major parts. The first part will be focused on presentation only. So three speakers will talk their story continuously without getting any questions. And each presenter is given approximately 80 minutes or 20 minutes. We have 55 minutes probably. Probably we have a 10 minutes break. After that, the second part will begin and will focus on discussion. We invited three discussants. Each discussant will be given around 10 minutes maximum. And after that, if time allows, then we will open discussion to participants online as well as discussant and speakers. We can freely talk about these topic areas. Of course, from the audience, there will be opportunity to participate. If you have any questions or comments to speakers, then please let me know. Send me a message, then I will forward that to speakers. Now, let me begin. Let me introduce the first speaker. First speaker is Dr. Richard Ronald. Dr. Ronald is professor of housing in the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Particularly, he was a visiting professor at the Kyung University in Seoul, so he knows some of housing issues in Seoul. So you may ask question about housing issues in Seoul too. Dr. Roland will talk about young urban singles in Europe and housing market responses in Amsterdam. So, Dr. Roland, would you begin your presentation?
Okay, I will share my screen. Now, can you all see my slides?
Yeah, we do see. Okay.
Okay, so 20 minutes, you say. Thank you. So thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation to speak today. And I'm going to be talking about my work on younger people and housing markets, but focusing on Europe and particularly the Netherlands. This is based on 2 papers I'm currently working on. And it comes about, what I'm really going to look at actually is not so much one-person households, not people living alone, but people living alone together. And particularly how in the last 10 years, there's been a sharp rise in the development of co-living housing and a restructuring of the shared housing sector in the Netherlands. And this is particularly intense in Amsterdam. And it connects to how housing has been restructured and how the economy of housing has been restructured in the city of Amsterdam, very much in the era since the global financial crisis. And it's useful to look at Amsterdam because it is not a free market kind of housing system. It's highly regulated. And I'm going to look particularly at changes, and I have the data since 2007, and I'm going to look at how radically the system's changed in that time, and how radically this has affected the pathways of younger people coming to Amsterdam to live, who are increasingly living in shared housing and co-living kind of developments. So my first proper slide is this one, which illustrates how prevalent one-person households have been in the European context. And you see Netherlands has a very early home leaving age and particularly high levels of one-person households that have grown in the last decade. And on the right side, you'll see, I'm afraid this is in Dutch, but the ages are simple. And we tend to think of one-person households in terms of older households, which are the biggest group, of course. But of course, the other peak is the early life course. Now, when we look at cities, and this is 2 graphs from the Netherlands. If you look at the left-hand side graph, this is a population pyramid with the city of Amsterdam. And what is particularly striking is that the population is very heavily younger people aged between 18 and 40. So people under 40 are the largest group of the population. And you also see on this graph that this is a sector that is projected to grow. So cities have become increasingly magnets for, are very important to employment trajectories and education trajectories, and so quite dominated by younger people, even though the demographic spread actually is at a national level more towards older people. And what I also wanted to show on this page is a kind of geography of singles. And of course, what we see on the graph, on the map on the right, is different concentrations of one-person households in the Netherlands. And of course, you see here the darkest parts are the major cities, where there's particular concentrations. And in Amsterdam, which is in the top left concentration level location there, there's about half of households in this city are one-person households. So there's an important conceptual shift here between what I'm talking about is not really talking about one-person households. What I'm going to talk about actually is a shift that there has been a diminishing number. We expect more one-person households in the coming 20 years. But what we see is amongst younger people is a shift to people who are not one-person households, but they are living alone, but in types of housing that have been stimulated by or promoted by the central government and the local government. The kinds of housing that house people more efficiently. And I would also argue that it's more profitably. And so we see particular interactions between how housing has been re-legislated in the Netherlands and deregulated in order to embrace the growing sector of investment flows into building for co-living for people, singles living together. So in a moment, I'm going to look in depth at a kind of typology of new kinds of housing that have emerged in the city of Amsterdam. But first, as kind of a background, it's worth mentioning these three different fields. And there's a literature around these three different fields, but they very much kind of clarify what's been happening in the last 10 or 20 years that has changed the playing field of housing, if you like, of shaped housing markets and housing policy development. The first one is this idea of an economic disruption. And what we really see is, like other places, rates of home ownership that have been growing for the previous 20 or 30 years are now in decline in the Netherlands. So home ownership rates are down, but particularly amongst younger people. So the economic disruption has been, especially since the global financial crisis, has been that employment markets have been less stable, that there's been more flexible employment, and younger people basically have less access to mortgages because they don't have stable work, but also because lending has been rationed more. But also what we see in Amsterdam is massive, in major cities like Amsterdam, especially since 2013, very significant house price inflation. And in fact, we're looking at, in the last 7 or 8 years, about 70 to 80% house price increases in the city of Amsterdam. And so the shape of the kind of post-crisis recovery in the Netherlands is very uneven and focused on the major cities, especially Amsterdam. And the second one to focus on is this idea of digital technologies have changed. And these are particularly pronounced, these changes, for in shaping the housing pathways of younger people. So younger people don't use the traditional techniques of finding housing that older people used. There are lots of kind of, I'm talking about the platforms and apps that people use to find housing, especially young singles, are growing in their influence. So the connections between the managers of shared housing, the owners of shared housing, people who rent shared housing, is all kind of in flux and is at higher speed and is shaped by kind of new ways of matching people to homes. So very much now people can use their phones and different kinds of apps to very rapidly connect to different kinds of accommodation. And the idea here is that it improves matching, but it also kind of increases the pace by which the city can respond to different kinds of people who want to live here. And the last technology I want to focus on here is this idea of financial technologies. What we really see since the global financial crisis is an intensification of financial flows directly into real estate, and especially into major cities like Amsterdam. There is also kind of a growing reach of global capitalism into major cities as a key growth area in the post-financial crisis years. We see new kinds of landlords, particularly large private equity firms, hedge funds, pension funds, even traditional kinds of investors, moving more extensively in investing in housing. And a hot market has been specifically co-housing, kind of large housing complexes. So I'm talking here about old sharing and new sharing, if you like. The complexion of the sharing market has changed. And Amsterdam is kind of quite typical of cities across Europe. And we see a transformation that there's the boom in renting. So there's declines in home ownership, booms in renting, especially amongst people aged 18 to 35. And we see small scale landlords increasingly entering into the market for housing, buying up more housing. So this idea that it's a cottage industry of small scale landlords, but we also see the influence of housing being a new asset class, that large scale investors are moving and are building large scale investments. And they have been very much in the Amsterdam context, which is deeply planned. The city owns 80% of the land in the city and can make deals with different kinds of developers, often social housing developers as well, and can very tightly plan where new housing gets built in the city. So we see on the kind of supply side a shift towards large-scale developers providing rental housing in the private sector, which is quite different to the traditional building social housing with social housing partners in Amsterdam. But what we actually also see, which is why Amsterdam's an interesting context, is that Amsterdam social housing providers are also very much becoming involved in providing shared accommodation for students and younger people, young professionals. We have the shift towards, so my second bullet point here, I've called it generation share, but generation rent is a term often used to describe the boom in younger people who are priced out of home ownership, who are renting. Well, increasingly, as Sophie Molson points out, they're not renting their own apartments anymore because that's also become unaffordable. So we have a massive shift in demand towards, amongst generation share, young people who can only afford to rent in the shared housing sector. So I've said here we've got an increase in HMOs. I think there's a presentation shortly about houses of multiple occupancy. And what I emphasize here is that the growth in cold sharing over hot sharing. And maybe my photographs make more sense here. You may recognize the apartment at the top. This is from Friends, a popular TV show from the 90s. This is Rachel and Monica's apartment, which was a kind of classic, iconic shared apartment for younger people. And this is warm sharing, where young people get together and rent accommodation together. And what we have increasingly is what we see at the bottom. This is a collective. This is not a Dutch example, but we have housing like this. But it's more famous, this picture. This is the collective in London. And this is a purpose-built development for around 500 people of small rooms, somewhere between 12 and 20 square meters, that are rented out quite expensively to essentially young professionals who are not necessarily seeking to rent an apartment on their own anymore. The other two things to understand in terms of understanding the shift from old to new kinds of sharing, which is like the collective here, is that deregulation has allowed developers, or in a Dutch case, the deregulation of renting, rental law, the new Housing Act, has facilitated new kinds of rental contract that didn't exist before. And this is very important in the Netherlands. So if in places like London, America, private rental contracts are very open. It's very easy for the tenant or the landlord to end the contract at any time to increase the rent. In Amsterdam, historically, rental contracts are as long as the renter wants them, and rents are controlled directly by the state. Now, since 2016, there's other laws have occurred. This has very much been opened up, that most new contracts for new tenancies are now short-term 2-year tenancies. And the last point I want to make about new sharing, which is much more flexible than before, is there's lots of new types of housing. So here I'm going to take you through Amsterdam case, which we associate with kind of traditional kinds of housing, but actually it's quite a flexible, high investment market, and that's how it's become in recent years. And it's become a center of investment.
Now, JLL, which is the source of this.
Oh, sorry, something's happening here.
Promotional company.
Sorry, I think I've got a recording on there. Anyway, what I wanted to show you with that map is that, Amsterdam is one of the second largest sites for commercial investment in co-housing, and it's actually the second largest market after London. But bearing in mind that Amsterdam is actually only 10% the size of London, it's a significant flow into the sector there. So I'm going to mention a few things now to kind of contextualize the Amsterdam housing context before talking about the different kinds of co-housing and shared housing that's been developing and is changing in the city. So the first thing to kind of show you here is a table that shows you how much the household composition has changed. Now the top three criteria here shows you how much the tenure sectors have changed. So what we really see is if we go back to 2007, around 69% of houses or homes in Amsterdam were rent-regulated housing. So we have this enormous social rental housing sector in Amsterdam. It's still more than half of housing. What's complex is that this regulated housing sector is made up of both social and private landlords. So the largest sector is social landlords, housing corporations, but also we have a points system. And the city allocates points to houses based on the quality, size, etc. And if you don't get enough points, you become actually, you fall into the same category of regulated housing as social housing, where the state directly controls rent, and there's a maximum rent of 750 euros a month. And what we see is this sector has massively declined in the last 10 years, but especially since 2013. And what we see is this massive growth more than tripling in size of the liberalized rental sector. And this is to do with government policies, particularly that the government has allowed the value of property to be included in the point system, which means a huge amount of regulated rental housing in Amsterdam has flowed into the unregulated or liberalized rental sector. So that's the first thing to say. So there's been a massive, significant decline, although it's very large still in the liberalized rental sector, but growth, sorry, in the rent regulated sector, and growth in liberalized, decline in regulated. The other thing to point out here is that there's also this demographic shift. There's been a growth in younger people and decline in middle-aged people living in the city in the last 10 years. But also, looking at the bottom part of this table, is that the shift, the demographic makeup of the younger population has changed remarkably, and that we have a massive decline in low-income people who are able to move into the city. And indeed, the proportion of high-income people, high-income younger people has been quite radical. And these younger people have basically moved to a city where they cannot access regulated rental housing. It's become very difficult to buy. And so primarily this sector of the population, this large, young, well-paid population is flowing into different kinds of liberalized rental, and also increasingly co-living and shared living. So we see a quite diverse sector of co-living housing in Amsterdam made up of different sectors. So this is a quick graph. I won't dwell here because I've only got a few more minutes, but here we see that amongst different age cohorts, it is amongst 25 to 34-year-olds where we see the most drastic changes in tenure of recent years. But this is the table I want to get to. I won't look at this as too much on this table, but this is a kind of a typology of the different kinds of shared housing that we now have in the city of Amsterdam and the rules surrounding them. And I'll go through them one by one. I have a minute each to look at these. So the first one I want to look at is traditional shared housing. So what did the original shared housing sector look like in Amsterdam, and how has it changed in recent years? Well, this is the kind of housing, this kind of warm renting, where landlords rent out property to multiple individuals. I'm thinking of younger individuals here. And what's happened with this sector in recent years is that it has become regulated, that the city government has stepped in. It has two types of shared housing that it recognizes. The first one is called living group, which is kind of a more flexible one. It's a lower cost kind of rental housing. It's usually where somebody who rents a house sublets to other people. And the more formal type is room-based rental, where a landlord literally rents out a number of rooms in a house to different individuals. So very much a cold form of sharing. So living group is a warm form of sharing. Room-based rental is a cold form. It's more expensive. And significantly, since 2014, it's been regulated. So landlords are required to register. And if you register, there are kind of regulations, building regulations that you have to apply to. These are to do with ventilation, insulation, overcrowding. Basically, landlords are being required to improve their properties of a full set of criteria. So what we actually see is a lot of landlords in the shared rental sector, the original traditional sector, are moving out. And they are being replaced by people in the more formal co-living sector. So starting at the top. Oh, another one of these, sorry. So the first one there I was going to talk about. I'm sorry, these recordings are in my slides. The first one there was, this top end is high cost apartments. They are built with often with workspaces, co-living workspaces. They're often sold as a communal way to live in the city of Amsterdam. They're very, very expensive. It's actually much cheaper to rent your own apartment often than live in these kind of co-living developments. But they have taken off in Amsterdam in recent years, and they essentially appeal to or attract young professionals, usually international ones, who are looking to live in the city. A more common form of housing, of new co-housing, has been student hotels. Now, I can't show you I'm not sure if the slide is big enough to see here, but where it says Hotel Janssen in the bottom left picture, it says not for tourists. So Hotel Janssen is actually a hotel for students, and so is Casa 400, this other one. And these are have very flexible contracts. You do not get a one-year contract, you get a contract for a few months at a time. Excuse me, let me go back there. And yeah, so students get a relatively expensive kind of housing if they live here, but also these houses, this kind of co-living developments often cater for, but essentially younger professional people too. They're supposed to be for students, but they attract kind of or sell kind of an idea of student lifestyle. And Hotel Casa, for example, rent rooms out on like a semester by semester basis. And when students are not there, the rooms are rented out as hotel rooms. So they're very much kind of a hybrid type of co-living. And the next one here, so I'm going the right way, is what we call aspirational co-living. So a lot of social housing providers have also become involved. And Start Block is a good example. I've called it aspiration because this kind of co-living is often cheap. It's often subsidized by housing corporations and often actually has social goals, which is why we've categorized it as aspirational. And places like Start Block, it's, as you see, it's made from former containers from ships. It's on a site on the inner ring road, and it puts together students with refugees or formal asylum seekers. So particularly in recent years, young Syrian asylum seekers. And so these housing, this kind of housing is, if you're a Dutch young white person.
Sorry,
yes.
Wrap up your
Yep, sure.
In one minute.
Yeah. So if I take 2 minutes here. The last category I wanted to look at was these friends contracts, and these are social contracts where social housing has been rented out to groups of younger people. But in recent years, private development companies have moved into this sector, and we see a big boom in people. This is an apartment built for 2 people to live together as not as a couple, as non-related adults on a shared contract basis. And what we see is in this sector is it's growing massively, but the government's rules on sharing have changed. And so the social rental ones, where there's more than 3 people, are having to fulfill the same criteria as private landlords in terms of amending buildings. So my last slide to kind of conclude. So I just wanted to give you kind of a quick run through the different kinds of co-housing we get there as part of this co-housing boom in Amsterdam. The final 5 points are this: that rising demand for one-person housing has actually made living alone too expensive for an increasing number of young singles. And this has led to a growing and diversifying sector of co-living, shared rental housing of people living alone together. This is driven on one side by a supply side that kind of the technologies, the management companies, the investment is very much being attracted to the sector because of its flexibility, because of the non-permanent nature of the contracts. But we also see incredible demand, of course, because the post-crisis economy has been driven by younger people moving to cities who can no longer afford to rent on their own or buy. So the local housing system is particularly useful. And I think I'm followed shortly by a focus on London and HMOs, because in Amsterdam, we do get social housing providers very heavily involved. We have a strong state who's very concerned with regulating the sector still, trying to keep the prices low, although it has led to prices overall increasing. And so we do see an increase in rents as kind of co-housing has formalized the shared housing sector. Now, thank you for your listening and thank you for your time. I think I've managed to do it in just around 20 minutes. Always difficult to do this as a Zoom presentation. But anyway, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Richard. Your presentation is very informative. I appreciate your presentation, and probably you may need another 30 minutes to talk about.
Yes.
Interesting story. I appreciate it. We will have further discussion later, but okay. Now our second speaker is Dr. Kwan-Fok Lee. Let me introduce her. She is Dean's Chair, Associate Professor of Urban Planning at the National University of Singapore, Business School, National. And she will talk about Singapore's housing policy. A focus on increasing assistance for single households. Dr. Lee?
Okay, can you see my slides properly? Okay. Thank you. Thank you for having me in the international session for the KRDA SMC joint seminar on housing. Special thanks to the KRDA President, Professor Jodo Ko, and the committee chair, Professor Ha Sang-gyu, and also the session chair, Dr. Choi Seung-yeon. Today, I'm going to talk about how Singapore has expanded its housing assistance to single households in more recent time periods. Here is the outline for my talk. First, I'll briefly introduce Singapore housing policies for those who are not very familiar with these policies. And then traditionally, a main dimension of housing assistance in Singapore has focused on public housing provision for homeowners and families. So I'll discuss this briefly. Then I'll discuss how Singapore has recently moved toward more inclusive and equitable policy directions that include expansion of housing assistance for single households, especially elderly households. And finally, the discussions and implications for Seoul and South Korea. The main feature of housing markets in Singapore is a very high fraction of public housing and high homeownership rates, reaching up to 90%. And we could see the majority of Singaporeans households reside in public housing, and up to 80%. And because of this, Singapore has dual housing markets of public and private housing. And along with this large-scale supply-side assistance of public housing programs, Singapore also offers demand-side assistance, including the housing grants. So that's the subsidy, cash subsidies from the government, and lower interest loans from the Housing Development Board. So again, the summary of housing policies here for Singapore. HDB as a main supply side intervention. And this BTO is the build to order, which is the direct supply from the government agency. And of course, the subsidized price is controlled, and it's a lot cheaper than the market housing. So there is a price control. And then there is this demand side assistance, which is the cash form of the grants, as I mentioned, and usually given for the first-time home buyers with a lower income. And then there is a low interest loan from the government agency. With this kind of efforts, Singapore has achieved quite good homeownership affordability. So compared to other global cities in the world, its median multiple is very low, maintaining below 5 in most times. For comparison, Seoul's median multiple is estimated to be over 10, and Hong Kong is like close to 20. A little more introduction of a public housing program in Singapore. It is administered and developed by the government agency called Housing Development Board, HDB in short. Public housing itself is also called HDB, and it allows private ownership of individual units, and homeowners are able to sell their units after 5 years of minimum occupation period. And we call this market as a resale market. So there is a BTO, which is the direct purchase from the HDB. And there is also a resale market after 5 years of minimum occupation period. People sell and buy these housing units at the market price in this resale market. So Singaporean government has believed from the very early time of its independence from Malaysia, when Lee Kuan Yew, the late Lee Kuan Yew has formed the country, he believed that owning their homes give Singaporeans a stake in the country and something to fight for when the chips are down. So this kind of homeownership has been a key national policy. It's really an important agenda for Singapore. And here, what we mean by homeownership is 99-year lease rather than the freehold. So this is a bit like unique feature for Singapore's housing policy. So 99-year can cover 2 generations. And that's why we believe this is a homeownership. And unlike other countries that have focused on the rental housing supply, like a US or other European countries, Singapore's housing policies have been homeownership oriented. And I believe most of you know other rationale and benefits of homeownership, so I will not go through those details here. For the HDB purchase, Singapore offers efficient mobilization of funds. One unique feature of the system is this pension system called Central Provident Fund, CPF in short, that home buyers could use their pension for their down payment and also the mortgage payment. In other words, as far as they continue to work, they should have no problem with making this public housing related payments. So buyers could get the low interest loan from HDB, that's the mortgage loan. And then also the CPF housing grant, that's the cash form of the grant from the government, which is the subsidies for the first-time home buyers that meet the eligibility, such as income and family composition. As mentioned, in Singapore, the national agenda has always been, they will promote homeownership in line with the family ideology that supports their national building. So in this table, we could see one of the most important eligibility for public housing application is to form the family nucleus. So you have to have a husband and wife pair, right? And then singles were not even eligible to buy any public housing until 1991. But since then, they could apply for public housing purchase when they remain singles until their age of 35. So I just, kind of make a joke that, oh, it's kind of pathetic. You remain single until in the age of 35, then you finally can buy public housing. So that's kind of the regulation in Singapore. And we can see how they have been sort of focusing on the family-oriented homeownership assistance. Also, more housing units are allocated for families, especially with the children. So they also get more ballot chances. Again, like this is very much showing that Singapore housing policy has prioritized families in need and over the single households until the recent time. Now, I would turn to how this type of housing policies in Singapore has expanded to single households in more recent time periods. Obviously, one important background is that there has been a huge increase in single households in Singapore over time, as you could see here. And this graph shows that the application for public housing has increased dramatically, especially in the recent time periods after 2017. Of course, one of the reasons for this trend is the demographic changes with a smaller household size. And if there are more households and in the market and in the application, of course, there will be a higher demand. At the same time, COVID-19 has driven housing demand up almost everywhere in Singapore. Of course, other global cities also have experienced the housing price increase with more liquidity and all other things. But in Singapore, one thing is that the remote working trends, right? So many domestic households wanted to move to larger housing units in public housing estates, so increase the housing demand in the suburban locations. On the other hand, in the private markets, in the more central locations, foreign the domestic investment is still on. So everywhere is kind of getting more expensive in Singapore. And singles used to be allowed to only buy public housing in the resale markets. Remember, there is a BTO, the direct purchase from HDB, and then there is a resale market. But since 2013, the government has sort of addressed the concern of the single Singaporeans being priced out of the resale public housing market, because resale public housing market is actually more expensive than the BTO, the direct purchase from HDB. So the policy began to allow singles to purchase new subsidized flats directly from the HDB since 2013. One thing to note is that the income wise, again, the income is half of the family's income, so it's $7,000, and then the singles should be still over 35 years for their application, and then they could apply on their own, or they can apply jointly for the public housing purchase. And then for these regular schemes right here is usually a 99-year lease, but for the elderly households in the more recent program, we allow sort of shorter lease period for like 15 to 45 years, and then these are more for the elderly households. And for the HDB unit allocation, the government has considered a fairer allocation and meeting the needs for different households. For example, singles need a lot smaller housing size than the families, so the majority of two-room units are set aside for the singles. And then the larger units, of course, are more set aside for the families. So we can have a more balanced allocation for different households. And then at least 40% of these kind of small housing units, the two-room units, set aside for the elderly applicants so that they can have the proper opportunities for their public housing purchase. In terms of the demand side housing grants, remember I talked about these CPF cash grants. For those who purchase the public housing, this is in the resale market, because resale market's more expensive. So the government provides more subsidies and more grants for those who actually buy in the resale market. And the families can receive up to $160,000 cash, so they can actually pay off the upfront down payment with this money. And then the singles are also eligible to receive half of this amount, which is $80,000. So that's a kind of big money. So if you buy two-room units in the resale markets, it's usually about like a $300,000 maximum, depending on the location. But the government gives you $80,000, and this is enough, more than enough, to pay off the upfront down payment, because down payment is 10% usually. And one interesting kind of grant also is the proximity housing grant. So if the elderly households and their kids, their other children live close to each other, right, within the 4-kilometer distance, then the government also provides this kind of proximity housing grant. So this is kind of ensuring the adult children live close to their parents, elderly parents, and then they can sort of exchange their labors, for childcare and also the elderly care, and they can form some sort of social security and bonding between them, right? And if they live together, actually it's a 30,000, up to 30,000, and if they live closer, it's $20,000. And singles are also eligible for this proximity housing grant if they are living close to their parents. And you could see more and more singles here, the red box, have been received these housing grants over time, right? So in the beginning, they have received a very few of the beneficiaries receive these housing grants, but over time, there are more singles who get benefited from these housing grant schemes. And now, among Singaporean single households, elderly households account for the majority of fraction. As you could see, like most of these single households are aged 50 over in Singapore. So to account for these housing needs for the elderly singles, the Singapore government has put a lot of efforts. One of the things is the retirement village features into the public housing developments. So this is the first pilot project of this kind of efforts, which is called Kampung Admiralty. And you could see a lot of community features, especially clinics, health-related community facilities, and abundance of greens, and small housing units here. It's a two-room housing units with the accessibility features for the elderly households. Now, the other programs target how elderly households could liquidate housing wealth and retain cash for their retirement. The Saver Housing Bonus supports households who downsize to smaller public housing units. And if they do this, the government provides us some additional pension bonus. And the lease buyback scheme similarly encourage elderly households to sell their remaining lease back to HDB so that they can cash out their home equity to their for their retirement purpose. And the government also provides some bonus for this. In addition to elderly households, other singles also suffer from housing problems in Singapore. So, for example, the divorced households with kids may be vulnerable to high financial and social risks. And also the same-sex relationships, widowed and the orphans are not actually eligible for public housing applications, so that they have to pay monthly rents that are quite high and expensive, and no subsidy again until their age of 35. So some of the new policy proposals regarding these kind of issues in Singapore include reducing the age limit. Remember, the 35 is quite high, right? So there have been some complaints, obviously. The other thing is a rental subsidy, or we can think it about like a voucher, like a US program. And this one is not really considered very favorably, very positively in Singapore still, because people think taxpayers' money will go to the private markets, and this is not really fair. Last one is the expanding the opportunities for single households to occupy HDB rental housing. HDB rental housing is a small fraction than the owner-occupied housing, but that at least there are like a 5% of the stock for the rental housing. So these kind of like expanding opportunities will be good for very low income and very needy households among singles. In terms of the private markets, there have been some efforts put into co-living spaces for young folks or the elderly households, which have been quite popular in other Asian countries like Seoul or Tokyo. Also, as well as the European countries, like what Richard said earlier in the Dutch context. And there have been 2 pilot programs related with this single household housing programs. The rental housing, again, they used to require 2 singles to jointly apply for the flats. Now, if they are really in the needy conditions, like a divorced woman with the kids, they could apply on their own. It doesn't have to be joint scheme. Another one is the shared caregiving service for the elderly households in assisted living public housing. So they try to put a lot of efforts on improving housing conditions and services for these single households in more recent time periods. So some conclusions. Singapore has tried to achieve affordable homeownership by delivering large-scale public housing, along with the demand-side assistance for needy households. Traditionally, housing assistance in Singapore has been family and owner-occupied basis. The society and government in Singapore started to accept the increase in single households and try to expand its housing assistance to those single households over time. And emphasis was on the most needed households, like elderly or the widowed or the divorced households, especially with children. Definitely, Singapore housing policies have moved toward more inclusive and equitable directions that have been shown in a lot of other developed countries like US, UK, and Australia. Although these countries used to focus really more on the rental policies, they recently have shifted to embrace more homeowners for their cash grants and other sort of subsidies. So what are the implications from these findings for Seoul and South Korea? Obviously, institutional and cultural contexts are very different between Seoul and Singapore. there are more singles in Seoul and South Korea, and some young folks from non-Seoul areas, they come to Seoul for their university education and get jobs here, and then they remain in Seoul. So then we need to support their housing issues because most of these young folks are singles. And this is different from Singapore because in Singapore is a city-state, and they all stay in the same city anyways, even after they go to the university and get a job. So until they get married, they usually stay with their parents. So the young folks issues are less prevalent in Singapore. And then, but we can also learn some lessons from Singapore's experience, other than this kind of young folks focused housing assistance, is that we should set the clear policy goals and targets. And this should really form the broader public consensus. For example, if we want to prioritize housing assistance for young singles, which is, I think, is a main sort of agenda for Seoul and South Korea currently. What is the rationale for this? Does this kind of assistance should this kind of assistance be prioritized over the assistance for other singles like elderly households? And we may want to further discuss the kind of following points. Every single country has limited resources. So how can we balance the needs of the different households? And again, who should we prioritize even among the single households? And finally, how can we enhance efficiency from both production and consumption perspectives? So I'll stop here and look forward to comments and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Thank you for your presentation. I also learned a lot about current Singapore housing policy. Now let's move to the third and the last speaker, Dr. Oh Young-oh. Dr. Oh is a research assistant professor at Lingnan University, Hong Kong. He is going to talk about the government responses to housing quality issues of house in multiple occupations in United Kingdom.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction by Dr. Choi. I'm Do Young from School of Graduate Studies at Lingnan University, Hong Kong. It's my great pleasure to be here online to introduce a case from the UK. So many audiences might not be heard of HMO. This is an abbreviation of house in multiple occupation. Basically, a HMO is a shared house where multiple households live in the same household, sharing some common facilities like kitchen, toilet, and so on. I've done some research on this topic when I lived in London with other research institutes in Korea. We have done some visits, interviews with local government HMO officer and so on. So, and I also lived in many different places in London over 10 years. So it's also based on my lived experience in London. Okay. So firstly, I want to mention the population increase in the UK before looking into HMOs. So unlike South Korea, the UK population keeps increasing. So when looking into England, over 10 years of time until 2028, the population is expected to increase by 4.9% to 58.8 million. And more importantly, the number of households, particularly one person and other households with two or more others, are increasing more rapidly. So for example, the rate of increase of one person household is twice that of the population. So here we see the increase of non-traditional forms of living and increasing pressure on housing supply. However, supply of housing has been never sufficient in the UK. So current conservative government aims to supply 300,000 housing per year in England. But in the past five years, the average annual supply was no more than 160,000. This number is actually larger than previous times, but this is largely insufficient to respond to the increasing demand on housing. And a lack of supply in housing means an increase in housing prices and a decrease in housing affordability. Then it has led to the rise of a private rental sector. So for example, in London, the private rental sector has been doubled in 20 years recently, until now. So this issue is more critical to even one-person household. Almost half of one-person working-age households in England are renters. This portion is twice that of working-age couple without children. So there should be many other reasons that one-person household decide to rent, but there is no doubt that housing affordability definitely matters to them. Let's look into further regarding housing stock issues in England. So as you can see from the graph on the left side, in England, a housing supply was more active between 1945 and 1980. Local authorities played a major role in housing supply. Then after the Thatcher government came into power in 1979, the local authorities' role in housing provision was almost diminishing. And also the Thatcher government initiated a privatization process of social housing. Through the right to buy policy, the existing social housing residents were able to purchase their homes at a discounted price. So over 25 years, 1.8 million social housing units were privatized through this scheme. So this massive transfer of social housing stock has two implications. First, these privatized housing stocks tend to have a higher value than non-privatized ones. So if a resident does not think it is worth buying it from many reasons, like housing conditions or neighborhood conditions, the person would not purchase it. Right? They just keep renting, paying low subsidized rent. So only good social housing are sold, and the local authorities eventually have housing stocks having lower values. It means local authorities need more support to maintain housing stocks, at the same time suffering from the reducing financial support from the central government. And second, these transfer stocks are now rapidly aged. So they are now like more than 50-year-olds or so. So maintaining aging housing stocks are also becoming more and more burden for homeowners as well. So in this regard, under the Labour government coming into power in 1997, introduced Decent Homes program. So as of 2001, 1.6 million social housing units were considered as non-decent. They accounted for 39% of all social housing. And at the same time, 1.2 million households were living in non-decent private rented homes. So this Decent Homes program invested £22 billion to improve conditions of social housing only. And thanks to this effort, the portion of non-decent homes are reduced to 12.3% as of 2019. So this graph shows this trend in non-decent homes, by tenure in London. So in general, the portion of non-decent homes has been reduced regardless of tenure. But as you can see, still private rented homes are relatively non-decent compared to other tenures. So in London, for example, around 17%, and in England, 20% of private rented homes are non-decent. And there were some other initiatives by the government to support the improvement of private sector homes, but most supports are now suspended under this conservative government. So now it's mostly landlords' duty to improve their houses. We also need to know what a decent home means. So this definition has been changed twice since 2000. Now the government is using the 2006 definition. So to be decent home, 4 criteria need to be met. So first, meeting the current statutory minimum standard for housing. Second, it needs to be in a reasonable state of repair. Third, with reasonably modern facilities and services. And lastly, it needs to provide a reasonable degree of thermal comfort. So for the first category, regarding the minimum standard of housing, the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, HHSRS, was introduced in 2006. This system is a risk-based assessment tool, so it's not a standard. And the system identifies potential threats to health and safety of residents. And this is assessed by environmental health officers at local authorities. So for the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, hazards are measured and banded between band A and J, and band A is the most dangerous hazard. And band A, B, and C are considered as category 1 hazard. The rest are considered as category 2. Two most common category 1 hazards are extreme cold and force on stairs, on the level, and so on. And the Housing Act 2004 has granted local authorities duties and powers to take enforcement action against properties containing hazard identified by the HHSRS. So for category 1 hazard, local authorities have a duty, legal duty to take appropriate enforcement action, such as a service of an improvement notice, prohibition order, hazard awareness notice, even demolition order or clearance action. So together with the HHSRS, the regulations on the HMO were introduced at the same time. So currently it is estimated 500,000 HMOs are existed in England and Wales. And there has been a two-tier approach to deal with HMOs for tackling poor management of shared housings. So according to the Housing Act 2004, large HMOs need to be licensed. The others are depending on local authorities' decision. A large HMO, according to the initial definition, indicate 3 or more floor homes with 5 or more residents who don't form a single household. So if you live, like 3-story housing, there are 2 couples, 1 couple has a child, then it is 5, right? Then you need this HMO need to be licensed, for example. And after 2018, this 3-story rule is abandoned. Initially, the government considered that homes with 3 or more floors have a significantly higher risk in terms of fire or other safety-related issues. But this rule is now removed. But purpose-built flats, like apartments in Korea, but still not considered as HMOs. So according to an interview I did with one HMO officer in London, the government considered the purpose-built flats are relatively safer, even though this might not be true when looking into the tragic Grenfell Tower fire happened in 2017. In any case, regarding HMO, local authorities now have several powers to intervene HMO properties, such as fines and rent repayment orders. Also, local authority can introduce discretionary additional licensing schemes. If a local authority wants to expand their licensing scheme, HMO licensing scheme, they could do it after seeking an approval from the central government. So HMO scheme has several benefits. So it is a criminal offense not to register a HMO. So the scheme first offers a chance to identify potential rogue landlords. It is not mandatory, but still local authority even can request license applicants' criminal record or some other relevant data when they are applying for the license. And also it prevents overcrowding of properties. And moreover, it can reduce potential hazard exposed to tenants because of this HHSRS inspections needs to be carried out within 5 years of a license application. So this is important because local authority can actually inspect private properties. So local authorities normally has no right to enter private property. Right? So the government obviously needs sufficient grounds for it or evidence, but it is actually very difficult for local government to collect such evidence. But this HMO scheme allows a local government officer can visit HMO properties, then they can give interim and final management orders if property does not meet minimum requirements. They can even withdraw a license as well. And interestingly, under this current conservative government, the regulations on HMO have been even strengthened. So Housing and Planning Act 2016 has granted additional enforcement power to local authorities. So now local authorities can give civil penalties up to £30,000. And also mandatory scheme has been strengthened as well. So as mentioned earlier, this 3-story rule has been removed. So now every HMOs with 5 or more people with 2 or more households need to be licensed. But still, even though these purpose-built flats are excluded, also the minimum room size is introduced. So it's 6.5 square meter for one person, 10.2 square meter for 2 people. So room need to be larger than certain size. And also HMO needs to be aligned with local authorities' waste disposal scheme. So if certain local authority has their own recycle scheme, they need to have certain facility, then HMO also need to be equipped with such facilities as well. And due to this changing rule, additional 177,000 HMOs are expected to be licensed. So how HMO regulations been enforced? A latest report by the National Residential Landlords Association shows that 71% of all civil penalties were issued by just 20 local authorities. So there are 333 local authorities in England. So this is a large concentration. So they call it as a enforcement lottery. So if you're an unlucky landlord, you will be enforced. And 6 London boroughs ranked in the top 10 local authorities serving the most severe penalties. In this regard, you can imagine housing conditions in major cities like London are relatively poorer than other parts of England. On the other hand, many local authorities simply do not have enough resources to deal with such a problem. So there is a license fee determined by each local authority. However, in general, these fees actually not sufficient to cover the actual cost for licensing. So in that regard, about 40% of London boroughs still rely on paper applications without actual inspection of properties. A further issue is that also there is no precise way of estimating the number of HMOs. So it is believed that many illegal HMOs are still in operation without license. I want to also introduce some information from London Borough of Camden. So Camden Council is one of the most active local authorities enforcing private landlord. So in 2018 and 19 financial year, there were 73 prosecutions and more than 200,000 court fines and 137 severe penalty notice. And Camden Council also launched its local additional HMO scheme from 2015. So any flats occupied by 3 or more people forming 2 or more households need to be licensed in Camden. This also includes purpose-built flats as well. So we can know that Camden Council operates stricter rules compared to national rules. So when considering this situation, we can think about 2 things. On the one hand, they show very vulnerable housing conditions for poor citizens. I mean, many HMOs operate illegally or with poor conditions. But on the other hand, this additional license scheme shows that now the government actually has more tools to tackle such housing issues. So I'm running fast. To conclude, so private sector in the UK is growing and more pressure to accommodate more people, but overall living conditions of private rented homes are improving. So overcrowding and health and safety risks are reducing according to the statistics, and thanks to a newly imposed regulations such as HSSRS or HMO. And more strict measures have been introduced, like changes made by the Housing and Planning Act 2016. But still, many illegal HMOs are in operation. And it is actually difficult to enforce it because there is no comprehensive tool by the government to identify them. You know, many landlords can just do it without doing licensing. So even local authorities actually does not have enough resources to enforce the system. And these illegal HMOs are often operated not only by local landlords, but by also organized agents. The agents are, for example, renting a flat from landlord and they illegally subletting it again. So we see, and lastly, when looking into the Camden's case, we see the willingness and resources of the local authority can be the key to solve private rent housing issues. As I mentioned, this additional licensing scheme by Camden Council can be the example. This is end of my presentation. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Lo. That was great presentation. Now, all of us three speakers made an excellent presentation. We are ready for further discussion. However, we would have a very short coffee break, 10 minutes. Right now is 3:12 here, the local time. We will meet 10 minutes later. Probably we're going to start the discussion at the 3:22 the local time. I will see you in 10 minutes. Thank you. Okay. So we are back. I already mentioned that the trio presenters made a great presentations. That's great. Everybody did a great job in completing presentation within time frame. We are a little bit behind, however, it is okay, according to our KRD staff. But now let's get into the discussion. We have a great discussant from the world, and first discussant is Dr. Hyun-Bang Shin. Dr. Shin is Professor of Geography and Urban Studies and the Director of SOSWIPOC, Southeast Asia Center. Dr. Shin, would you please begin your discussion?
Thank you. It was a great pleasure to be listening to three very exciting talks. Apologies, I think I muted myself. Thanks so much again.
Oh, sorry, I didn't.
It was exciting to hear the three great talks, and I learned a lot from these presentations, especially about one-person household situations in Amsterdam, Singapore, and London. And I believe the three discussants have been allocated to certain papers. So in my case, I tried to focus my discussions on Singapore and to some extent on Amsterdam. And given the time constraint, I tried to make it brief. And my talk will be, or my discussion will be largely on three aspects. One is about understanding one-person household. Second, situating one-person household in real estate market. And third, a few comment on the ideological dimensions, especially who is responsible for addressing the need of one-person household and a housing need. So first of all, the understanding of one-person household. And here I want to kind of start by saying any policies to address the problems of one-person household or their housing need to be targeted, and this requires a clear understanding of who they are. So in the previous talks, we have heard from our speakers on Singapore and Amsterdam that there is a large share of elderly people who are falling into this category of one-person household. And of course, in cities like Amsterdam, there's also a growing share of younger generation who falls into this one-person household. But then again, I think we need a bit more information. We need a bit more understanding of who they are, especially in terms of their socioeconomic profiles. And I just wonder in this regard whether there's any kind of studies or government surveys that try to reveal the socioeconomic profiles of one-person households that we are referring to. And I guess this is probably the same question that can be posed to a city like Seoul or South Korea, where we talk a lot about one-person households, but we don't really hear not much about who they really are in terms of how much they are able to afford different types of housing, whether they are elderly but in different economic and social circumstances, and so on and so forth. So it will be useful to get some ideas from Singapore and Amsterdam whether in these cities there are any ongoing studies or government efforts to try to understand a bit more about their profiles. Second, situating one-person household in real estate market. Here, what is struck by these three talks is the fact that all these three cities are frequently known for high housing prices, and they all often feature very high in the rankings of real estate prices, right? So Singapore, London, and Amsterdam are probably in the top 15 or top 10 or top 15 when it comes to many consultancy reports about real estate prices, and they often featured as being one of the most expensive cities to live. So in that regard, I mean, what that also means is there's always going to be the issue of how housing is being treated as assets, and the emergence of what Richard Ronald was referring to as the asset class. And also there's obviously the emergence of asset class in the context of high housing prices and real estate acting as assets. There's always going to be asset inequality as well, and which is probably aggravating over time, which also leads to another type of inequality, which is basically the intergenerational inequality. So those elderly population who are able to enter the housing market as homeowners in the 80s and 90s and who are retiring or who have retired and basically having had a chance to actually gain a lot from investing their asset in housing market, whereas the new entries, the younger population, not really having a chance to do so unless they inherit the asset from their parent generation. So what in that kind of context, what does it mean to talk about one-person household? And here a few further points to raise. One is how are we going to address the inequalities between asset poor and asset rich, and especially when it comes to how such assets are going to be transferred to next generation, and what happens to those more precarious asset poor one-person households who are in younger generation categories. And this probably is going to produce a lot of social tensions, conflict across, not only across generations, but within generations. And I guess it'll be useful to hear a bit more about how these are featuring and coming out as whether they are becoming a social phenomenon in societies like Singapore and the Netherlands. There's another issue, which is regional inequalities. So as shown by the talk by Richard, especially in the context of situating Amsterdam in the larger Netherlands, I just wonder, many of these policies that were introduced, whether this can be something that is also applicable to other regional cities. So we hear about how Amsterdam has been coping with these issues, and Singapore, of course, is a bit of exception given it's a city-state. But when you think of the Seoul situation, very often we talk about housing policies, which are very often becoming housing policies for Seoul, which is less likely to be applicable to other regional cities that do have very different housing markets. And I just wonder also in the context of Amsterdam and the Netherlands, whether this is also the case and how much this is something that can be applicable to the entire nation or to different regions within the country. There seems also something about greater likelihood of gentrification emerging in the context of Amsterdam, similar to what can be seen as studentification. A lot of these new types of co-sharing, co-living, or student hotels that Richard was introducing to attract young professionals, and also the investment by private developers to increase their share in such accommodations in the regional housing markets, do seem to produce potentially a greater possibility of displacing or producing what is known as exclusionary displacement, which is basically the reduction of affordable homes for local residents. And I was just wondering whether there is any such kind of instance or emergence of such phenomenon that also occurs in Amsterdam, and whether there has been any measure to address this. More importantly, there's precarity among young singers, especially those asset poor. So I guess this is the same for not only Amsterdam, but also in Singapore and London as well. And I think in this case, what I also point out is the issue of property hegemony, which is tied to the issue of asset class as well. That is an overarching emphasis on accumulation of real estate assets. There's a continuous call for more supply of standard units for traditional family living. And this is what often turns out to be the case in many demands for more housing units to be supplied. And this often turns out to be basically the same in a fairly spacious housing unit for family living, which is often consumed by asset-rich one-person households with the support of their families. So I guess there's always going to be an issue of how these more precarious one-person households are going to cope in the society in their host cities, and it'll be useful to hear about how these issues are being addressed. This difference inequality experienced by asset-rich and asset-poor one-person households, and especially with more attention to precarious young singers. Finally, in terms of ideological discourses, so under the prevailing neoliberal ideology, there is an overarching emphasis on individual responsibility. This may apply not only to the younger generation, but also older generation as well. So basically, you are responsible for your own care needs, whether or not you are young or old. And as argued by Beng-Hua Chua, who was professor of sociology at National University of Singapore, in his book, Liberalism Disavowed, what is interesting is that in Asia, including Singapore, which was the main topic of Beng-Hua Chua's book, for which I believe is applicable to wider Asia, there's a greater emphasis on society over the individual, pervasiveness of the state, and social redistributive policies in order to support the legitimacy of the state. And under such circumstances, individual rights are relatively restricted, while responsibilities are disproportionately large. And the example of Singapore seems to indicate that the state has assumed some responsibility, but there still seems emphasis on traditional conformist understanding of what family should be, and also emphasis on family as the main loci of social life. So such emphasis on family concept thus disadvantage non-conformist relations, as Kwanok was referring to towards the end of her talk. And such non-conformist relations would include the same-sex couples and so on and so forth. So in this kind of situation, I just wonder, this increased emphasis on individual responsibility, while at the same time there's a greater emphasis on society over the individual, which leads to the restriction of individual rights. And also there's greater emphasis on an occurrence of deepening inequalities across generations and within generations, given the way in which asset accumulation enhances the inequality in terms of asset possession. And I just wonder how these two tensions, the greater role of the role of the state that emphasizes society over individual, versus a greater emphasis on individual responsibility, ultimately speaking, how this is going to address this growing problems of inequalities that one-person households may experience across generations and within generations. And finally, I just want to conclude by saying, and here I refer to this event that Richard yourself participated as a speaker back in May this year in Lingnan University in Hong Kong, which was entitled Housing as Intergenerational Project. And I think this was quite an interesting concept, and I think there is something to learn about this concept, how to approach the issue of housing as intergenerational project. And very often when you come to think about intergenerational support, we often think about asset-rich parents supporting their families to build up their housing asset. But I guess this is more to do with how, as the society as a whole needs to approach the issue of supporting the younger generation, especially those who are not able to have a chance to accumulate their asset to be surviving in our society, and how this consensus can be produced following what sort of discussions. And this is always going to be a difficult task because of the dominant the property hegemony that we often we encounter across the world. So I think I stop there and hand over to the next discussant. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Shin. That's great comments and the questions. And I hope the speakers may save this comment and questions until further discussion complete their comments. Now, second discussion is Dr. J. Kim. Dr. Kim is Emeritus Professor of Housing and Urban Development at the Keimyung University in Korea. Dr. Kim.
Yeah, above all, I'm very pleased to hear all three of presentations. They are wonderful, and I have no objection about what the speakers talk. Yes, there is a similar housing situation in Korea, like other countries, especially characterized as less accessibility to affordable housing for young people, as well as old people too. So the question is, will Korean youngsters like share housing, similar with the ones in Netherlands? I'm quite dubious about the result, that the increasing popularity about those share housing, etc., is stem from cultural difference, or it's I'm sure that that's a result of market mechanism, as well as some degree of government action. as the previous discussant said, high-income people has no housing problem. The real problem is in for low-income people. So, so the topic of this seminar is seeking direction in the housing policy for a single-person household. So what can we learn from this seminar? Surely other countries' experience can help to implement more effective housing policy. What is speaker's policy recommendation for Korean poor young singles? That's what I really wanted to ask to the speakers of today. Of course, the relationship between policy object and the policy result is not simple or linear. There are so many factors which affect policy effectiveness. We have stimulated home ownership of young people by imposing heavy tax on people who own more than one house. These multiple house owners give their house to their son or daughter to avoid heavy tax. This is ironically very effective policy to increase home ownership for youngsters of rich people. On the contrary, youngsters of poor middle class face a severe difficulties to meet their housing need by their own ability. What should we do for them? As Professor Sin said, housing problem is, in this perspective, really intergeneration problem. So, it's quite strange to Korean housing situation that housing policy should focus on increase in home ownership, like in Singapore. But in Korea, we have some social consensus that we should provide housing opportunities rather than home ownership. So I want to hear that what kind of policy based on Singapore, United Kingdom, and Netherlands experience should we implement to reduce our housing problem for poor youngsters as well as elderlies. As you know, all the singles also have severe housing problem in Korea, and our Korean society is shifting to hyper-aged society rapidly, and housing situation is not ready for them. So, as I said, I have no objection about what speakers talk, but I want to hear what can you do for Korean youngster and all these elderly housing problem. This is what I want to talk today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. And now we have a third and last discussant is Dr. Son. Dr. Son is Associate Professor of Urban Economic Development in Bartlett School of Planning, University College, London. Dr. Son, would you begin your discussion?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this interesting session, Dr. Simon Che. And it is also nice to see familiar faces and names, though even if it is online in this session. I have comments about the issue in general, and then all three papers, and then I will move on to the questions and then the comments about individual papers. Firstly, I would like to say a few words about the issue that is related to all three papers, which is about a younger generation's housing problem. I guess this traditional public and the social housing system assumed the marriage in late 20s or early 30s and have children in or around that age. So in that sense, the increase of these new type of rental homes for singles in private sector seems to be the evidence for the failure of the traditional system and its demographic assumption behind it. I guess it was partly pointed out by three presenters, but I just wanted to make it explicit by saying this. But the more fundamental issue that I I hope you, the three speakers, can respond to is the fundamental issue, which is about the issue itself. These days, there is a lot of talk about younger generations' housing issues in Korea and everywhere else. Part of the cause of that talk is that discussion is the objective fact that the younger generation is likely to be poorer than older generation for the rest of their life. But on the other side of this debate, or maybe behind this debate, there might be an ideology that sees welfare expenditure as a social investment rather than welfare expenditure itself. So if it is an investment, the investment should be directed to more productive group of people. So that is why expenditure for younger generation is more easily legitimized than expenditure for older people. But if we take this investment issue out of this equation, it is quite obvious that it's not the age itself. It is about who needs it more. When we focus on the need, for me, it is apparent that older people with lower income has more needs than younger generation in general. So that's one of the things that I wanted to point out, and I would like to hear your views about this. And moving on to the individual papers, I have many questions about Singapore. These are questions out of my ignorance on this issue. And I suspect people in the audience might be in a similar situation as I am, because we don't talk about Singaporean housing issues all the time. So firstly, it looks like public housing in Singapore means that the housing units produced by or supplied by government, then and the prices were set lower than the market price. If it is lower than the market price, how is it possible financially? How does government finance this scheme? Professor Kwan Lee. Professor Kwan Lee explained how individuals were subsidized by the government, but maybe I missed it, but in the presentation there wasn't any explanation about the supply side financing. So if it is set, the price is lower than market price, how is it economically feasible from government point of view? And another question is there enough new land to develop, or or is it usually redevelopment of existing built environment? So how is the land supply? That's the second question. And right, and the next, I also have questions about the UK issues that Richard and Do-young discussed. So I was a bit surprised to learn that there is I've been living and working in London for the last 16 years, but this is relatively new to me. So I was quite surprised to learn that there is a quite tight regulation about the quality of housing for the singles, especially the minimum size of minimum room size for one person, 10.2 square meter. That's pretty big.
It's 6 for one.
Sorry?
6 for one person, 10 for 2 people.
Oh, I see. 2 people for 10 minutes. Oh, so that changes my question a little, because I thought that was too big, and such a tight regulation would decrease supply, and which will make younger people suffer even more. But 6.5, that's small, and that's probably the minimum. So that changed a little, but so I was curious if there is a study about the influence of regulation on the supply, the quantity of supply. So obviously regulation will influence supply negatively for sure, but the reduced supply should be justifiable in terms of in exchange of improved quality. Right. So if there is justifiable, that's fine. But if the reduction of supply is bigger than the social gain of improved quality, it is not justifiable. So I was just curious if there is any study about it. Comparing to Seoul's situation, I mean, in Seoul, for places like Goshiwon and the Balchip, there are regulations about safety, but there is almost no regulation about the quality of the housing. The positive outcome of it is that there is unlimited supply of this, and their prices are extremely low. So it is relatively easy for young people to find the shelter, put a roof on above them, but the quality is obviously not satisfactory. So comparing these two situations, I was curious whether regulations on the quality in London is justifiable, even if it reduces supply. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stone, for good comments and questions. We have a bunch of comments and questions. I believe you guys already took a note, right? And by the order of speech, we're going to start with Richard to respond to comments and questions. If they didn't answer question to you guys, the comments and questions, please remind later. So Richard, you can start.
How long have I got? About 2 minutes, 3 minutes?
Probably, you can use more time. 5 minutes. What about
Okay.
5 minutes? All right.
Yeah, sure. Great. Thanks.
Yeah, some great, wonderful questions, lots of questions, and it's difficult to where to begin. But I think it's best to kind of think, for me, logically, in terms of kind of just broader social changes that affect housing in cities. And one that's quite universal, and I kind of do work in East Asia and Japan still, and also these days China, as well as Europe. And what we see nearly everywhere is this declining rates of home ownership. And we see declining rates of home ownership everywhere, driven by declining rates of home ownership amongst younger adults under 40. And when this trend began, it precedes the global financial crisis, so early 2000s, and was very much treated as a temporary, people delaying entry to home ownership. What we now see is there's a whole cohort, a whole generation of people who are simply not following the same housing pathways as their parents. And kind of linking to questions from everybody really, there's lots of questions about policy. What do governments do? And I think what we see is that it's been very hard for governments and policymakers to think in different ways. So there's this domination of home ownership policy. There's this domination of an old model where it was assumed that a low-income or a middle-income household would be able to, at some point in their early life, buy a house, accumulate an asset. And what we see is this is breaking apart. And this is quite disruptive more broadly, more socially. And this is why I'm going to link it to single households, is that they're connected. Declines in fertility, declines in household formation are connected to the fact that younger adults can no longer, they're connected to marriage markets, housing markets, and labor markets. The secure work, regular housing, and finding a partner and starting a family career are all closely linked in different ways in different countries and different cities. And that the problem for young people in getting on the housing ladder, which is connected to housing prices and changing labor markets, is all connected, and it's creating more one-person households. It's undermining marriage. It's undermining fertility. So it's that in itself is creating the demands for new kinds of housing. And the problem for policymakers is how to think beyond this traditional model of wealth accumulation through home ownership. So thinking about specific places, and I've just published a special issue of the journal Social and Cultural Geography last month, when we look at urban singles. And actually, I'm doing this in both in Amsterdam and Tokyo. We see very similar patterns. And we see kind of in this post-global financial crisis decade that we've had, and it's also been enhanced under COVID conditions, as this new asset class. So you have this, on the demand side, is that there's this growing number of people with fragmented life courses, fragmented labor market careers, and fragmented housing careers. And that's creating huge demands. And then it's being filled by kind of the wall of global money that's looking for investment. And so we're having this big boom in co-living and these kind of shared housing, also building actually very, very small scale single units for singles. And I'm not looking at older people here, I'm looking at younger people. So this seems to be I've seen that we see this in Tokyo, we see this in Amsterdam, we see this in Sydney, in Australia, all kinds of different places. It's quite a universal transformation. And the context really shapes it there. So to go and kind of respond to some other questions that we've had about, for example, you mentioned something about the regional city. And what we have in Amsterdam is, overlapping developments in the economy and in urban transformations. That actually Amsterdam used to be very close to kind of the national average on housing, on house prices. And what we see is it's breaking away, that Amsterdam is becoming a much richer region within the country of the Netherlands. And we see a shift to do with the economy as well. There's more of the financial sector moving here, but it's creating different demographic demands. So there's a lot more young people, a lot more wealthy young people coming to the city and displacing people. What's interesting, I think, for an international audience about Amsterdam is the long social housing tradition that we've had for a long time. How do I put this? We have too much housing for low-income people and not enough low-income people. So we have a very different problem to other cities. And so the government also has different challenges in thinking about, and what it's concerned with is matching. That it's trying to, because we have such a large residual of social housing, there is a large amount of low-cost housing for low-income people. The problem is that those people don't move. So the problem is that we can't get people into the city other than by increasing the deregulated sector and by increasing the market share. And so the focus on policy is actually on growing middle income private rental housing. So that's the challenge for us that's quite different to other places. We have also this infrastructure where housing corporations still build most housing in the Netherlands, especially in Amsterdam, where the city owns most of the land, where we have this point system, where the local government, the city government of Amsterdam, actually has considerable power to do a lot more. And it's very interesting to contrast that actually with Dr. Young's presentation on London, which is kind of very far the other way, and also Dr. Lee's presentation on Singapore, which shows you very strong regulation, but within a very, very different set of logics and frameworks about what housing is for and what the government should do about young people's housing. So I'll finish on that point, actually, that what should governments do? Who's responsible? We've had this kind of 4 decades of pushing individual responsibility and accountability for housing, that it should be a market issue. But now it's emerging that actually that market doesn't really serve the needs of a stable demographic population growth, of stable life courses. And therefore governments now begin, I think you can see it in Netherlands and other places, and in Singapore and even in London, that governments are now thinking of different ways of approaching the new housing problems of the 21st century. So I have no chance there to really address every question, but I thought that's a decent amount of response to what I think are the key issues. Anyway, thank you for letting me respond to those.
Thank you, Richard. Now, Dr. Lee, would you respond to the comments and questions?
Okay, thank you so much for very insightful comments from 3 discussants. I will first respond to quickly to 2 questions from Professor Son Jung-won. Okay, the government agency, HDB, that is in charge of public housing supply, get the land at the market rate. From another agency, this is also the government agency called the Singapore Land Authority, that is in charge of land management. So Jung-won, we are right that this always lead to huge financial deficit for HDB. As the Singapore government is very committed to this public housing supply, as I mentioned, it reserves 2 to 3% of its annual budget, which is about $2.5 billion Singapore dollars every year to fill this deficit. That's how they sort of do the finance for housing supply. And also this the cash assistance for the low-income households. The second one is about the land, right? Availability for public housing development. Singapore's planning system is very much top-down, and it has been very efficient and very long-term. So it has reserved some of these land banks in the nation, and then these are where the large-scale new public housing developments occur. They also do some redevelopment. So the land recycling is a very much a key point for Singapore's system. So for the public housing development, the lease term is 99 years, but even before the lease ends, the government can plan redevelopment. They can compensate for these existing owners, and they can do the redevelopment. This is where the smaller scale redevelopment projects are done, and they use the higher density to supply more housing in a better location. So that's 2 responses. And then I also want to respond to Professor Shin Hyun Bang's comments. So first question was the economic and social circumstances for these households we are talking about. In Singapore, most of the households that live in public housing and also who apply for public housing are middle class. So we know that the most of the elderly households in Singapore that I was talking about, and also we target, are largely middle class households. Although there are some lower income households, the majority are the middle income households. But Singapore government is still committed to support these middle class households. And then the second comment was on the intergenerational inequality for housing assets, and this is also related with the, I think, the comment from the Professor Kim Jae-ik. Singapore definitely also has a related issue, but less so, I think, compared to other countries. Because remember, we have a leasehold scheme. So everybody has a 99-year lease for their public housing units. So this kind of ensures, again, the land recycling and sort of intergenerational inheritance to the younger generation. So in fact, one of the rationale for the housing programs that I introduced earlier, that target the elderly households, like the silver housing bonus, that is kind of supporting the elderly households to downsize, or the lease buyback scheme that supports the elderly households to sell their remaining lease to HDB. So that, these kind of programs to ensure, they really try to ensure recycling of the units so that the younger households can have a better opportunities for the housing purchase. So we can really ensure more recycling of these units, right? So I think the key kind of question is, again, to resolve this kind of intergenerational issue is how we should sort of enable recycling of the limited land resources and limited housing units so that the younger households can still have the opportunity to purchase this housing at the reasonable, affordable housing price. In terms of the regional inequality, I think Singapore is less relevant, but still, there are more prime locations and less prime locations within Singapore. The government has recently wanted to address more of these kind of issues. Before, most of the public housing units are located in suburban locations. Now they are starting sort of to discuss whether we should provide more public housing in the prime locations. And in fact, there has been a new regulation that was out for this prime housing, prime public housing. So it's going to have the shorter leases and also the longer minimum occupation period. So we want to ensure more households can get benefits out of this kind of prime housing policies. The last comment was on the ideology, sort of the dilemma between the role of the government and the individual responsibility, which I think is a really interesting comment. Singapore is a country, as Professor Shin mentioned, that put a lot of emphasis on the state role especially for housing assistance, as I mentioned. And it remains more or less same over time, even now. So especially the elderly households, the society wants to pay more attention to them because they are the pioneers of the country and the nation building, and we have to pay back to these elderly households. That's kind of one rationale, and most of the people agree. But like I mentioned, the government really encourages more personal intergenerational assistance. Like I said, the housing grants, right, paid for these adult households who buy public housing near their elderly parents' homes or who live with their elderly households. There are a lot of government incentives, so they encourage this kind of personal assistance between the generations. Now for the young singles, I think the government still pays less attention, and they try to sort of put the less responsibility for those singles, rather than those who form the households, because they want to prioritize these family formation for their national housing, national agenda, and also to have more sort of young people in the population structure. But again, the trend, the general trend in the developed countries in general, but also in Singapore, is a more inclusive and more sort of equitable policy agenda. And this is why Singapore government has recently tried to address more of concerns of these even young singles, and then try to embrace some of these needy households, especially not the general singles, but those who are in really hardship. They try to provide some assistance. So I will stop here, and maybe we'll just have more discussions if the time remains after all this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Dr. Oh.
Okay. I will be precise. Thanks all for all the very good comments. So I will just try to address a few of them. I think in the UK, regarding elderly population, I think in the UK it's not a serious issue. When we see the population projection, the ratio of elderly single population stays more or less same. So they actually, it doesn't give additional burden to government, but working age population, not just young people, but like 30, 40, 50 years old group are increasing. Single household is increasing. So I think that's kind of more issue that government is facing nowadays. And so I'm thinking in every society, every country has some kind of gray area accommodating vulnerable household. In Korea, we have like 고시원, 쪽방. HMO probably something like this in the UK, but also in the UK there are many kind of hostels, like for example hostels for homeless people. I think it's kind of accommodate more like vulnerable people. So in the UK, local authority has legal duty to protect homeless people. They have to actually provide housing for homeless people, but not just homeless people, but threatened to be homeless people. So there are kind of protection system for more vulnerable housing groups. So I think HMO is kind of serving that kind of people above like homeless or threatened to be homeless people. So this is, I think, where we have to locate HMO. So there is a kind of survey done by English housing survey actually says those single household, working age single household are relatively feeling vulnerable, feeling unhappy with their lives. So they actually need more kind of special, I guess, treatment. But policies are, I mean, as commenters mentioned, largely focusing on like more productive group of people than like single household, I think. But there are many other supporting systems like housing benefits or social housing. So not just only HMO, but there are many other ways of supporting people as a like legacy of welfare state in the UK. And for me, I think it's also very surprising the fact that the UK government introduced this minimum room size in 2018. You know, like you think conservative government is very can be very notorious. Right? They promote like home ownership very actively, but on the other hand, they also introduced this minimum room size. But this actual room size, 6.5 square meter, is not new. It's actually already mentioned in Housing Act 1985 as a like recommended size of the room. So it's not like legally probably imposed much, but this number has been there for a while, and they introduced as a like mandatory scheme. The problem is, I think, as you probably know, Professor Jang Won-son and Hyun Bang-shin probably knows better. The enforcement in the UK is not, you know, very like active or forceful compared to Korea. So as you said, you probably don't know where about HMO. You probably may not know the existence of this rule. And if you're a kind of normal landlord just renting out your flats to different people, there's no way that government actually detects this and also enforce this. And those tenants also are not aware of HMOs as well. Right? There's no, it's not kind of well advertised. Like local governments always suffer lack of financial resources or human resources, especially since 2008 financial crisis, the austerity rule. So there is I think this rule, very, I think, desirable rule, but the actual enforcement is, I think, different story. So still there are many illegal HMOs, unregistered rogue landlord and property agents, but they might not be actively implemented, and they won't be actively implemented, unfortunately. So So as I mentioned, the willingness of I think local authorities to impose this rule is quite important. And I don't think there are much research on this, so I cannot tell how this minimum room size will affect the housing opportunity for vulnerable group of people. But this is, I guess, minimum room size. So I guess we need this for protecting like tenants. So I will stop here. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oh. We now heard about the discussion, comment, and question and response. And you have any additional comments and questions? We have almost, the end of session. Okay, if you don't have, I have a very short question for each of speakers. First, for Richard, I know you talk about Amsterdam, and I saw the age pyramid and over there, and looks like city of Amsterdam shows pretty much more share of young people over there. And very strange in this aging society everywhere in the world, and I don't know. And then also you mentioned young urban singers are shifting toward the co-housing, co-living, all those things, and you show us diversity of co-living formats, and I see that. Is that unique to the city of Amsterdam or Netherlands, or is that applying to other countries like United Kingdom or your neighboring countries or other countries? That's my question. Second, for the Dr. Lee and Singapore, when I look at the housing supply trend, I saw tremendous increase in public housing in 1970-80, and then after that is very slowing down. And I don't know, since this is housing supply is driven by government, right? And I don't know if the housing supply is relatively growing slow because demand is low, or what? Or that is second question. And third one for Dr. Lo. I'm very impressed with the HMO stuff in United Kingdom, and by introducing this kind of system, probably the United Kingdom has improved housing quality a lot for those housing in multiple occupation. And do you think that kind of system can work in South Korea as well? So that is my question. Let's start with Richard.
Hi there. Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'll try and be brief. Yeah, the unevenness of aging. So we talk about all these social trends, aging society, regional shrinking. It's incredibly uneven, and you see this unevenness has been enhanced in the last 10 years. And Amsterdam is radically, I mean, I've lived here 12 years, radically changed in the time I've been here. And physically as well, the city is changing. And the government is quite aggressive to a certain extent, and it has lots of money to invest in kind of pushing Amsterdam as a way of driving the economy as a whole. So there's sometimes like the national government kind of ignores us, and sometimes it's kind of engaged with us in terms of economic growth. But the city of Amsterdam itself has a much more left-wing government than the national government. And we still have these protections in place in terms of the scale and size of social housing and housing benefits. And because of that, it's meant that there's lots of room to do other things. So I would suggest this growth of co-living is quite extreme in Amsterdam, but it's to do with the fact that we're shifting from an old system, which is strongly social housing. I mean, back in the 1990s, social housing was 75% of housing. And then the last 20 years have been that they're pushing and promoting home ownership. And that is now kind of ground to a halt. And so now the room is that new things can be built. And so there's lots of space, and the government, local and national, really wants to create room for a different kind of housing that is kind of a flywheel for the system as a whole. There's very little kind of flexible housing in Amsterdam. So this co-housing fits into the idea of creating a new sector that helps balance and lubricate the other ones. And so you see co-living at other places at different scales, but that's why it kind of takes this shape in Amsterdam. So thank you for the question now. It gives me a chance to say a little bit more there.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Would you answer the question?
Sure. So yeah, it's right that kind of Singapore has slowed down its public housing supply after 2000. The main reason is because it has already achieved 90% home ownership, and then the housing stock is like over 80%. Public housing stock is over 80% of the entire housing stock. And Singapore population increase is very slow. You know, it's not really naturally growing. And then most of the population increase actually is coming from the immigrants. And immigrants are not really living in public housing. They are not eligible anyways. So for them to sort of recycling these units, again, you know, remember there is a leasehold and recycling system for public housing. So this is quite sustainable system. Once they reach this kind of 90% home ownership, 80% housing stock of public housing, then they can continue to recycle these units to meet the housing needs for the local Singaporeans. And that's one of the reasons why they have slowed down the supply.
Thank you, Dr. Loh.
Okay, yeah, it's very difficult question to answer, but I think Seoul has a better situation compared to London, because London's population is still increasing, but Seoul, I guess, is start to reducing. So since supply pressure is less, I guess there are more rooms for the government to react. Obviously, one size fits all approach or radical change won't work, but probably we need some gradual changes to improve these conditions of vulnerable housing groups, and I believe it definitely needed for you know, not just younger generation, but for elderly populations as well. And this is actually a more serious issue in South Korea. I think. Yeah, I will stop here.
Thank you very much. Now it's time to wrap up the talk. I would like to, note key takeaways from our session. From the big perspective, first, I learned that there is increase in singles and a single household in European countries and Singapore and United Kingdom as well. And there are a couple of response housing market from the housing market response. You know, we do see more newer co-housing and co-living options, as we saw in Amsterdam. And the third, we have we saw the government response and from the Singapore case, and we do see, government pay more attention to the single household, in particular, most needed single household. They could be or elderly, whoever it is. And another government response from the United Kingdom, and they are concerned about housing quality, in particularly for the people of multiple occupations. I think those things pretty much what I learned from this session. And thank you very much for presenters, discussants, and audience for attending this session. And the final one, how about a round of applause for speakers? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Good to see you all.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.